ביסון יבוא יודון אשר אתם מבקשים משיח שיבוא ביסון יבוא יודון משיח שיבוא.
So this is our final shiur in the sugya of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael Bizman Hazeh. So after we discussed the various different aspects and discussions regarding Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, we started off with the fact that the Rambam omits and does not count Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as one of the Taiga mitzvahs, and we went me'inyan le'inyan, mesugya le'sugya, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the prohibition to leave Eretz Yisrael and to go to Chutz La'aretz, the question which mitzvahs justify leaving Eretz Yisrael and going to Chutz La'aretz. So the topic today is really fascinating. It is the obligation and the chiyuv lehitkadesh be'eretz Yisrael. Coming to live in Eretz Yisrael is not only a privilege. There's a responsibility, it's a liability, it's an obligation. The Shlo HaKodesh, Sharu Ois Kuf, Kedushas Hu Achila. And the sources I will be quoting at the beginning of today's shiur are in chronological order. The Shlo quotes the Charedim. The Charedim was somewhat older than the Shlo, Rabbi Elazar Askari living in Tzvat, and the Charedim writes, Kol haboam lo doru be'eretz Yisrael, those that come to live in Eretz Yisrael, chayovim le'ezor ma'oid b'shmita, need to be very, very diligent in the mitzvah of Shemitah, or b'kol hamitzvot hatluyot be'eretz Yisrael, kishem sheyu zirim lekaimam ha'amoroim adorim bo, כדאיסה בירושלמי, כדי שלא תהיה מצווה אדירה בארץ ישראל, מצווה בו בעברת של ביטל מצווה התלויס בו, ונמצא הפסדון יויסר על זכורון, ואלוקי ישראל יעזרנו לקיים, Amen. So the Charedim writes, those that come to live in Eretz Yisrael need to be especially careful in mitzvah Shemitah and all the other mitzvah Tluyas Ba'aretz. Otherwise, it might be somewhat similar to a mitzvah bo ba'avera. And the Shlo shares with us his personal experience. And the Shlo writes, when I came to live in Eretz Yisrael, and the Shlo lived in Prague. When I was in Prague a few months ago, we visited the shul, the Shlo's shul, where the Shlo used to daven. And the Shlo writes, when I came to live in Eretz Yisrael, Shona achas achar boi liyerushalayim ira kodesh. So the Shlo is married up north. But he says, when I came to live in Yerushalayim, most of the people living in Yerushalayim were not Mekayim Mitzvah Shemitah. Poverty was terrible in Israel, and people barely could put bread on the table, and many people weren't diligent about Mitzvah Shemitah. But the Shlo writes, they're living here, they were born here. But I came from Chutz La'aretz to live in Eretz Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu might ask me, why did you come? Did you come to my holy land not to perform its mitzvahs? You might as well have stayed in Chutz La'aretz. So the Shlo writes, I felt more obligation and a greater chiyuv than all the others that are living here that were born here, because I came from Chutz La'aretz. And that is why I felt I need to be more careful. And I was Mekayim Mitzvah Shemitah with Mesirus Nefesh. That is what the Shlo writes. So the Shlo and the Charedim stress the same point. Those that do Aliyah and they come here from Chutz La'aretz need to be more diligent, more careful, and more dedicated to perform the mitzvahs atluyas ba'oretz. And they quote the Gemara Sotah Daf Yud Daled. Moshe Rabbeinu nesav el hakonis li'eretz Yisrael. And we know, according to the tradition of Chazal, that Moshe davened 515 tefillas with one bakosha. He should be zeicher to come to Eretz Yisrael. Ve'eschanen el Hashem keminyan ve'eschanen. The gematria, the numerical value of the letters of Eschanen is 515. And the Gemara says, why did Moshe So much want to come into Eretz Yisrael. Did he want to eat the beautiful fruits of Eretz Yisrael? It was all about mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz. The Chaya Odom. And the Chaya Odom writes something startling, surprising. And in 2 points he goes far beyond the Charedim and the Shlo. So the Charedim and the Shlo both lived in Eretz Yisrael. The Shlo lived in Yerushalayim, the Charedim lived in Svas. The Chaya Odom wasn't Zoicha. The Charedim and the Shlo are known primarily for the Chasidus, for the Tzidkis, even though they were both great Gedolim. The Shlo has many Piskei Halacha, the Magen Avraham quotes them all the time. The Charedim wrote the Perashan Yerushalmi, Mesechet Brochos. But the Chaya Odom was primarily known as a Poisek. And in Shaarei Tzedek, Mishpatei Eretz Perek Yud Aleph, the Chaya Odom writes, and I want to quote what he writes because it's so powerful. After he writes, there's a mitzvah Yishev Eretz Yisrael b'zman hazeh omnam loy kol haroitza litles Hashem la'alois ya'ale. ואף על פי דבמסניסניק על הכל מעלן היינה דווקא משיש ויודע לקדש את עצמו ולהתטהר ולעבוד את השם תומד בכל ליבוי והוא נקי כפיים ובעל לבו. And the Chaya Odom has an interesting interpretation of the Posuk in Tehillim Perek Chov Daled. Mi ya'ala b'har Hashem u'mi yakum b'mkoim kodsho niki chapayim u'ba'al levov. The Chaya Odom says the Posuk refers to Eretz Yisrael. Mi ya'ala b'har Hashem mi yakum b'mkoim kodsho means Eretz Yisrael. Niki chapayim u'ba'al levov refers to the two fundamental pillars of Torah. Mitzvah sheben odom l'chaveiroi, mitzvah sheben odom l'mokoim. Niki chapayim ben odom l'chaveiroi, ba'al levov ben odom l'mokoim. And he writes, it is only those. Roitz Eloimo. Niki chapayim ben odom l'chaveiroi. And then ba'al levov. And that is the entirety of Torah. And he quotes the Shlo. And the Shlo doesn't even write those words. Misha einoi miskadesh u'mistayer sham mutav shelo ya'ale. So the Chaya Odom goes beyond the Shlo and the Charedim. They talk about mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz, and the Chaya Odom talks about all the mitzvahs. Not only mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz. If you want to do Aliyah and come to Eretz Yisrael, you need to be more careful and more diligent. Niki chapayim ba'al levov, the entire system. Kol ha'Torah kulo, ben odom l'chaveiroi u'ben odom l'mokoim. And the other point to which he takes this idea to an extreme, Misha einoi miskadesh u'mistayer sham mutav shelo ya'ale. How could you say that? He has a mitzvah Yishev Eretz Yisrael. So the fact that he's not going to be the greatest tzaddik patters him from one mitzvah because he's not going to do the others. Misha einoi miskadesh u'mistayer means he's going to be a good Jew. He's a frum Jew. He's going to be as frum in Eretz Yisrael as he was in Chutz La'aretz. That is not enough. He needs to be a tzaddik. V'misha einoi miskadesh u'mistayer mutav shelo ya'ale. That is taking this to an extreme. The Shaarei Tzedek, in the continuation of that same discussion, writes in the name of the Mikubalim, Eretz Yisrael is surrounded by water, bodies of water. So we have the Mediterranean to the west, the Jordan and the Dead Sea to the east, the Litani to the north. Eretz Yisrael misuvevet b'mayim, and that is a remes. Before you come into the land, you need to be toivel. You need to purify yourself. You need to be metaya. And it doesn't just mean going to the mikveh. It means going to the spiritual mikveh, purifying your neshama, your soul, your midas, your heart. So that is a gewaldige chiddush from the Chaya Odom. Yes, there's a mitzvah to come to Eretz Yisrael, but if you can't really be miskadesh u'mistayer in the entire realm of Torah, mutav lo shelo ya'ale. And that's a gewaldige chiddush. I'm not sure whether the Satmar Rebbe Rabbi Yoelish Zechat Tzadik v'Kodesh Levrocha, and you know his shitta, v'Yoel Moshe, I don't recall whether he quotes the Chayyodam, but the Chayyodam should be the most powerful source to substantiate his argument and his ashkofa and his shitta. Because the Chayyodam really is a gewaldige chiddush. Misha einoi miskadish u mistayer mutav lo shelo yale. That is far beyond what the Shlo and the Haredim write. They refer specifically to Mitzvah Tluis Baretz. And it's far more reasonable. You came to Eretz Yisrael, you need to be medaktek and mitzvahs shel Eretz Yisrael, like Moshe Rabbeinu and Esava, l'kayim mitzvahs atluis ba'oretz. Is there any early source like the Chaya Yodam? Fascinating tshuva of the Radbaz. And the Radbaz is Chelek Esemachov Zayin. There's another count in the Radbaz from the beginning till the end of the last Chelek, and it is Elef Tov, 1,400. The Radbaz have thousands of tshuvas. Anyway, Tshuvas Radbaz deals with the question, Evet sheborach le'eretz Yisrael, Chazal teach us, Mesachet Gittin. If a slave ran away from its owner, and he did Aliyah in Eretz Yisrael, now we don't chase him out of the land to give him back to his owner. We cannot take a Jew out of Eretz Yisrael, even not an Evet Kanani, who has a Miktzas Dina Yisrael. Sanhedrin Nun Ches, the expression of the Gemara is, and the Radbaz deals with the question, so if the Odin does Aliyah, because the Eved means so much to him, and he has so much worth in his eyes, that his Eved fled to Eretz Yisrael, so he's going to move to Eretz Yisrael after him. Is the Eved Yotzei L'Cheres? Does he become a free man because he came to Eretz Yisrael? Or the master still has a right to take him back into his possession as an Eved? And the Radbaz asks an interesting question. Chazal should be metaken that he still is an Eved to encourage the master to come to Eretz Yisrael. And the Radbaz writes, if the only reason this Jew wants to come to Eretz Yisrael because he wants to keep hold of his Eved, we prefer stay in Chutz La'aretz. That is an expression that is somewhat similar to the Chai Yodam. If you're coming to Eretz Yisrael not because you want to be a tzaddik, not because you want to be niskadish, not because of the Sefes Kedusha, not because you want to become a greater and holier person, you might as well stay in Chutz La'aretz. But I don't think it's the same. I think that Radbaz is first of all a guzme and a harsh expression. Chazal didn't go out of the way to make it the kona to encourage children to come to Eretz Yisrael, because if that is your only motivation to come to Eretz Yisrael because it's money and it's about your slave, you might as well stay in Chutz La'aretz. And the Radbaz also speaks about a person that doesn't really want to live in Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't want to come to Eretz Yisrael. He's not coming neither to perform the mitzvah Tluis Baretz, not even to be Mekayim the mitzvah Yisrael Eretz Yisrael. It's just about greed and about money and about holding on to the slave. I would agree with that, Radbaz. If that is your motivation, you might as well stay in Chizos. We don't need that type of Yidden in Eretz Yisrael. But it still is far from the extreme of the Chai Yodam. Chai Yodam deals with the person who wants to come to Eretz Yisrael, wants to become the Mitzvah Yisrael Eretz Yisrael. He's a from person. He's going to be as from in Eretz Yisrael as he was in Chutz La'aretz. That is not enough. Em einoi miskadesh u mistayer mutav lo shelo yale. The Ramban, and this is a fascinating Ramban, and the Ramban is in Droshes HaRamban Rosh Hashanah. So let me give you a short introduction. Droshes HaRamban Rosh Hashanah is one of the great chiburim of the Ramban. It's a sefer, and I'm just checking out in Droshes HaRamban that I have, in my publication, which is Droshes HaRamban Moised Harav Kook. How many pages does this take up? 42 pages. So you could imagine, this isn't the drosha that the Ramban said on Rosh Hashanah. This drosha would take 2 or 3 days to say. There would be no Tkiya Shofar, no Malchei Zechron Shofars. Drosha Ramban Rosh Hashanah is a chibur, it's a sefer. obviously something to learn a month before Rosh Hashanah in preparing to the holy day. Yom Adin, Yom HaRachamim, Yom HaMishpat, HaYom HaRas Olam. But towards the end of the Rosh Hashanah, Le Rosh Hashanah, I'm quoting the Ramban, Nimtza kiruvon shel Yisrael etzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu agorim rechukom. The closeness is also a dividing factor. The closer you come, the more you're pushed away. What does he mean? The kolshken mazoichen leishev lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu bi'artzoi shem kamo royei pnei HaMelech ve'im zehirim b'chvoidoi toiv lehem v'ashreihem ve'im mamrim boi. If they betray HaKadosh Baruch Hu, oy lehem yoisem mekol habriyos shem oisem malchamo machisen es HaMelech b'palteren shaloi. You're in the Melech's castle. You're in his home, and you fight him in his own home. Umoitziel men apaltin k'moishoim arakosov, ha'ama mechisa moisiel ponei tomid, lo yeshvu be'eretz Hashem. So, the Ramban writes, those that come to Eretz Yisrael, and they're not observant, then it's worse. Oy lehem yoisar mekol habriyos. But once again, the Ramban speaks about Oisem Abom Le'Yisrael Umamrim Boy, and they betray HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're not observant. So none of the sources I quoted comes close to essentially what the Chai Odom is saying. If you want to come to Eretz Yisrael, you need to take upon yourself to be more diligent and more careful in all the mitzvahs ben Odom Lamoka Mirodach Chaveirei, and Im Eino Miskadosh Ubestayor Mutav Loi Shelo Ya'ale. That is a great chiddush, and I think it's taken this idea to the extreme. But how could we b'chlal argue that if you're not going to be as you should be, then don't come? I think I briefly mentioned a few weeks ago, but I cannot remember exactly what I said. And maybe I emphasized this idea more in the Shir in Lashon Kodesh than in English. Essentially, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Reb Moshe has two tshuvas, very brief and short tshuvas. But in both tshuvas, he says a gewaldige chiddush. Igres Moshe, Even Ezer Chelek Aleph Simen Kuv Beis. And you would ask, why would a tshuva in Be'inyan Yishuv Eretz Yisrael be in Even Ezer? Shouldn't be. But the person asked Moshe a few questions. The first was about Even Ezer, and that is the majority of the tshuva. But towards the end of the tshuva, there's a short paragraph about Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and Moshe reiterates and reinstates his opinion. Once again, Igris Moshe Yerdei Chelek Gimel Siman Kuv Chav Beis, and that is also a very brief tshuva. And Moshe writes, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not a mitzvah chiyuvis, it is a reshus. So many times I explain there are three different categories of mitzvahs asay. Mitzvahs chiyuviyos, which are incumbent upon every Jew. You're chayiv to say Krishma Shachas Varvis, to daven 3 dvilas every day. You're chayiv l'aniach tefillin b'kol yom. You're chayiv in Sukkah v'lulav. You're chayiv in Matzah and Moror. You're chayiv in Korban Pesach bezman shebeis hamikdash orikayim. These are mitzvahs chiyuviyos. There are other mitzvahs you're not mechuyev only if you engage in an activity which in it to itself is not a mitzvah. You're not chayiv in tzitzis unless you put on dalat kanfas. You're not chayiv tumas hamaisis unless you eat peretz eretz Yisrael. But at some stage and in some circumstances, these mitzvahs become a chiyuv. If you put on dalat kanfas, you're chayiv in tzitzis. If you eat meat, you're chayiv in shchita. But there are other mitzvahs that are never a chiyuv. Kiyum yesh, bitul ein. Kohen b'achilas truma, achilas peresh shvius. So Moshe argues, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah, it is not a chiyuv. And that is why we find in Chazal, also l'tzeis mi'etz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz. But nowhere do we find in Gemara that it's a chiyuv gomer, an obligation, to move from chutz la'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, because that is not a chiyuv. Reb Moshe's predecessor in this approach is Dafka, one of the greatest Gedolei Eretz Yisrael, Reb Shmuel Salant, that for 50 years was the Rav in Yerushalayim. Reb Shmuel Salant wrote very little, if at all. But in a periodical called Halevanon that was printed in Eretz Yisrael more than about 150 years ago, one of the scholars, one of the Chachamim, quoted Reb Shmuel Salant saying exactly this approach. Yeshiva Yisrael is a mitzvah, it's not a chiyuv. And according to this opinion, we could understand those Gedolim that say, if you can't really be diligent and dedicated in the performance of your mitzvahs, better stay in Chutz La'os. If it would be a chiyuv, this wouldn't make sense. If you have a chiyuv of Yeshet Soul, why would the fact you're not going to be a big tzaddik pata you from a chiyuv? But if it's not a chiyuv, but rather just a mitzvah, then we could understand the condition. If you want to be Makayim this mitzvah, you need to take upon yourself. In Eretz Yisrael, you got to be a good Jew. You are living in the king's home. You are bechatzar hamalchus, and therefore more is expected from you. The fundamental approach of Reb Moshe, I think, is extremely reasonable according to the first shir I said in this series. If you remember, we dealt with the question, why doesn't the Rambam bring the mitzvah of Yeshet Soul? And that's the kash of the Ramban. And what I explained is, according to the Rambam, there is no tzivui, there is no direct command to come to Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam's understanding in the Psukim, v'yirishtem ma'aseh v'yishaftem bo, v'hoirashtem esoretz v'yishaftem bo, those are mitzvahs specifically given to Yeshua ben Nun and Dora Midbar, kovshei Eretz Yisrael kibish oretz. But throughout the ages, the source of the mitzvah is Bris Ben Abesorim. The mere fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised Avraham Avinu, Lazaracho eten esa oretz hazois. And that's not enough. He promised the same to Yitzchak, he promised the same to Yaakov. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised our Ovos HaKadoshim, this is the land, your land, and the land for your children, isn't that enough to prove that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will that we live in Eretz Yisrael? But that is a gather of Ratzon HaTorah. And on my swarm, I discussed this at great length. Ratzon HaTorah. That is not a chiyuv. That is a mitzvah. Chiyuvim artar yag mitzvahs be'ikar reish memches mitzvahs say. Those are chiyuvim. Ratzon HaTorah is a mitzvah, but not a chiyuv. So according to the Rambam, Reb Moshe's approach is extremely reasonable. So besides the chiyuv and the mitzvah of Yeshivat Yisrael, we could talk a lot about the segulas of Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban has a gewaldige chiddush, few different sources in Ramban al Torah, primarily Droshes al Ramban Rosh Hashanah. Ikul kiyam Torah and mitzvahs is in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz asher einei Hashem Elokecho bo mereish Yishonu adach l'shonu. And Chazal speak about Avira Yisrael, which is Machkim. Kol shedar be'etz Yisrael do mekil mi sheyesh lo Eloka, hadar b'chol sos do k'mi she'ein lo Eloka. These are segulas of Eretz Yisrael beyond the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So those of us like me that have the schus to live in Eretz Yisrael need to be thankful for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we live in Eretz Kodshenu, and especially in Yerushalayim Yira Kodesh. All of you that don't have this goal, I hope that someday, ultimately, Kadosh Baruch Hu will be Mekabetz Nidachei Yisrael, and we will live in Eretz Yisrael, and Kadosh Baruch Hu Yishlach Moshiach Tzedkeinu v'yevneh lonu Beis Mikdoshenu v'Sifarteinu b'mheiro v'yomeinu. Amen.
Mashiach, 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 שיבוא, ביזיון יבוא, Mashiach, שיבוא.